Section 1 of the Collected Writings from the Fantasy Fan Magazine by Clark Ashton Smith. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Ben Tucker. The Collected Writings from Fantasy Fan Magazine by Clark Ashton Smith. The Kingdom of the Worm. Forward. Every fantasy reader knows Clark Ashton Smith, and he needs no introduction. Not only is he the favorite of thousands, but his work has been said to rival and even surpass Poe. Although as a general rule we do not take sides, we admit without the slightest hesitation that we enjoy Clark Ashton Smith's tales a great deal more than we do Poe's. Even those that find Smith's work altogether too fantastic must admit that no other author has nearly as beautiful a vocabulary, and few have as great an ability to produce the utterly weird effect as our present author. He claims that The Kingdom of the Worm is one of his weirdest and most original of his tales, and we are inclined to agree with him. Let the story speak for itself. This tale was suggested by the reading of The Voyages and Travels of Sir John Mandeville, in which the fantastic realm of Abchaz and the darkness-covered province of Hanison are actually described. I recommend this colorful 14th century book to lovers of fantasy. Sir John even tells in one chapter how diamonds propagate themselves. Truly the world was a wonderful place in those times, when almost everyone believed in the verity of such marvels. Now in his journeying, Sir John Mandeville had passed well to one side of that remarkable province in the kingdom of Abchaz, which was called Hanison, and unless he was greatly deceived by those of whom he had inquired the way, could deem himself within 2 days' travel of the neighboring realm of Georgia. He had seen the river that flowed out from Hanison, a land of hostile idolaters on which there lay the curse of perpetual darkness, and wherein it was told the voices of people, the crowing of cocks, and the neighing of horses had sometimes been heard by those who approached its confines. But he had not paused to investigate the verity of these marvels, since the direct route of his journey was through another region, and also Hanison was a place into which no man, not even the most hardy, would care to enter without need. However, as he pursued his wayfaring with the 2 Armenian Christians who formed his retinue, he began to hear from the inhabitants of that portion of Abchaz the rumor of an equally dread demesne named Antchar, lying before him on the road to Georgia. The tales they told were both vague and frightful, and were of varying import. Some said this country was a desolation peopled only by the liches of the dead, and by loathly phantoms. Others that it was subject to the ghouls and afrits, who devoured the dead and would suffer no living mortal to trespass upon their dominions. And still others spoke of things all too hideous to be described, and of dire necromancies that prevailed in Antchar, even as the might of emperors doth prevail in more usually ordered lands. And the tales agreed only in this, that Antchar had been within mortal memory one of the fairest domains of Abchaz, but had been utterly laid waste by an unknown pestilence, so that its high cities and broad fields were long since abandoned to the desert, and to such devils and other creatures as inhabit waste places. And the tellers of the tales agreed in warning Sir John to avoid this region, and to take the road which ran deviously to the north of Antchar, for Antchar was a place into which no man had gone in latter times. The good knight listened gravely to all these, as was his wont, but being a stout Christian, and valorous withal, he would not suffer them to deter him from his purpose. Even when the last inhabited village had been left behind, and he came to the division of ways, and saw verily that the highway into Antchar had not been trodden by man or beast for generations, he refused to change his intention, but rode forward stoutly while the Armenians followed with much protest and some trepidation. Howbeit he was not blind to the sundry disagreeable tokens that began to declare themselves along the way. There were neither trees, herbs, nor lichens anywhere, such as would grow in any wholesome land, but low hills mottled with a leprosy of salt, and ridges bare as the bones of the dead. Anon he came to a pass where the hills were straight and steep on each hand, with pinnacled cliffs of a dark stone crumbling slowly into dust and taking shapes of wild horror and strangeness, of demonry and satanry as they crumbled. There were faces in the stone, having the semblance of ghouls or goblins that appeared to move and twist as the travelers went by. And Sir John and his companions were troubled by the aspect of these faces, and by the similitudes which they bore to one another. So much alike, indeed, were many of them that it seemed as if their first exemplars were preceding the wayfarers, to mock them anew at each turn. And aside from those which were like ghouls or goblins, there were others having the features of heathen idols, uncouth and hideous to behold, and others still that were like the worm-gnawed visages of the dead, and these also appeared to repeat themselves on every hand in a doubtful and wildering fashion. The Armenians would have turned back, for they swore that the rocks were alive and endowed with motion in a land where naught else was living, and they sought to dissuade Sir John from his project, but he said merely, "Follow me and ye will," and rode onward among the rocks and pinnacles. Now in the ancient dust of the unused road they saw the tracks of a creature that was neither man nor any terrestrial beast, and the tracks were of such unwonted shape and number, and were so monstrous withal, that even Sir John was disquieted thereby, and perceiving them, the Armenians murmured more openly than before. And now as they pursued their way, the pinnacles of the pass grew tall as giants, and were riven into the likeness of mighty limbs and bodies, some of which were headless, and others with heads of Typhoean enormity. And their shadows deepened between the travelers and the sun, to more than the umbrage of shadows cast by rocks. And in the darkest depth of the ravine, Sir John and his followers met a solitary jackal, which fled them not in the manner of its kind, but passed them with leisurely pace, and bespoke them with articulate words, in a voice hollow and sepulchral as that of a demon, bidding them to turn back, since the land before them was an interdicted realm. All were much startled thereat, considering that this was indeed a thing of enchantment, for a jackal to speak thus, and being against nature, was fore ominous of ill and peril. And the Armenians cried out, saying they would go no further, and when the jackal had passed from sight, they fled after it, spurring their horses like men who were themselves ridden by devils. Seeing them thus abandon him, Sir John was somewhat wroth, and also he was perturbed by the warning of the jackal, and he liked not the thought of faring alone into Antchar, but, trusting in our Saviour to forfend him against all harmful enchantments and the necromancies of Satan, he rode on among the rocks till he came forth at length from their misshapen shadows, and emerging thus, he saw before him a grey plain that was like the ashes of some dead land under extinguished heavens. At sight of this region his heart misgave him sorely, and he misliked it even more than the twisted faces of the rocks and the riven forms of the pinnacles. For here the bones of men, of horses and camels, had marked the way with their pitiable whiteness, and the topmost branches of long dead trees arose like supplicative arms from the sand that had sifted upon the older gardens. And here there were ruinous houses, with doors open to the high drifting desert, and mausoleums sinking slowly in the dunes. And here, as Sir John rode forward, the sky darkened above him, though not with the passage of clouds or the coming of simoon, but rather with the strange dusk of midmost eclipse, wherein the shadows of himself and his horse were blotted out, and the tombs and houses were wan as phantoms. Sir John had not ridden much further when he met a horned viper, or cerastus, crawling toilsomely away from Antchar in the deep dust of the road, and the viper spoke at it past him, saying with a human voice, "Be warned, and go not onward into Antchar, for this is a realm forbidden to all mortal beings except the dead." Now did Sir John address himself in prayer to God the highest, and to Jesus Christ our Saviour, and all the blessed saints, knowing surely that he had arrived in a place that was subject to satanical dominion. And while he prayed, the gloom continued to thicken, till the road before him was half nighted, and was no longer easy to discern. And though he would have still ridden on, his charger halted in the gloom, and would not respond to the spur, but stood and trembled like one who is smitten with palsy. Then from the twilight that was nigh to darkness, there came gigantic figures, muffled and silent, and having, as he thought, neither mouths nor eyes beneath the brow folds of their sable cerements. They uttered no word, nor could Sir John bespeak them in the fear that came upon him, and likewise he was powerless to draw his sword. And they plucked him from his saddle with fleshless hands, and led him away, half swooning at the horror of their touch, on paths that he perceived only with the dim senses of one who goes down into the shadow of death. And he knew not how far they led him, nor in what direction, and he heard no sound as he went other than the screaming of his horse far off, like a soul in mortal dread and agony. For the footfalls of those who had taken him were soundless, and he could not tell if they were phantoms or, haply, were veritable demons. A coldness blew upon him, but without the whisper or soughing of wind, and the air he breathed was dense with corruption and such odors as may emanate from a broken charnel. For a time, in the faintness that had come upon him, he saw not the things that were standing beside the way, nor the shrouded shapes that went by in funereal secrecy. Then, recovering his senses a little, he perceived that there were houses about him, and the streets of a town, though these were but scantly to be discerned in the night that had fallen without bringing the stars. Howbeit he saw, or deemed, that there were high mansions and broad thoroughfares and markets, and among them, as he went on, a building that bore the appearance of a great palace, with a facade that glimmered vaguely, and domes and turrets half swallowed up by the lowering darkness. As he neared the facade, Sir John saw that the glimmering came from within, and was cast obscurely through open doors and between broad-spaced pillars. Too feeble was the light for torch or cresset, too dim for any lamp, and Sir John marveled amid his faintness and terror. But when he had drawn closer still, he saw that the strange gleaming was like the phosphor bred by the putrefaction of a charnel. Beneath the guidance of those who held him helpless, he entered the building. They led him through a stately hall, in whose carven columns and ornate furniture the opulence of kings was manifest, and thence he came into a great audience room, with a throne of gold and ebony set on a high dais, all of which was illumined by no other light than the glimmering of decay. And the throne was tenanted, not by any human lord or sultan, but a grey, prodigious creature, of height and bulk exceeding those of man, and having in all its over-swollen form the exact similitude of a charnel worm. And the worm was alone, and except for the worm and Sir John and all those beings who had brought him thither, the great chamber was empty as a mausoleum of old days, whose occupants were long since consumed by corruption. Then, standing there with a horror upon him such as no man had ever envisaged, Sir John became aware that the worm was scrutinizing him severely, with little eyes deep folded in the obscene bloating of its face. And then, with a dreadful and solemn voice, it addressed him, saying, "I am king of Antchar, by virtue of having conquered and devoured the mortal ruler thereof, as well as all those who were his subjects. Know then that this land is mine, and that the intrusion of the living is unlawful and not readily to be condoned. The rashness and folly thou hast shown in thus coming here is verily most egregious, since thou wert warned by the peoples of Abchaz, and warned anew by the jackal and the viper which thou didst meet on the road into Antchar. Thy temerity hath earned a condign punishment, and before I suffer thee to go hence, I decree that thou shalt lie for a term among the dead, and dwell as they dwell, in a dark sepulchre, and learn the manner of their abiding, and the things which none should behold with living eyes. Yea, still alive, it shall be thine to descend and remain in the very midst of death and putrefaction for such length of time as seemeth meet to correct thy folly and punish thy presumption." Sir John was one of the worthiest knights in Christendom, and his valor was beyond controversy. But when he heard the speech of the throned worm and the judgment that it passed upon him, his fear became so excessive that once again he was nigh to swooning. And still in this state he was taken hence by those who had brought him to the audience room, and somewhere in the outer darkness, in a place of tombs and graves and cenotaphs beyond the dim town, he was flung into a deep sepulchre of stone, and the brazen door of the sepulchre was closed upon him. Lying there through the seasonless midnight, Sir John was companioned only by an unseen cadaver and by those ministrants of decay who were not yet wholly done with their appointed task. Himself as one half dead, in the sore extremity of his horror and loathing, he could not tell it were day or night in Antchar, and in all the terms of endless hours that he lay there, he heard no sound other than the beating of his own heart, which soon became insufferably loud, and oppressed him like the noise and tumult of a great throng. Appalled by the clamor of his heart, and affrighted by the thing which lay in perpetual silence beside him, and whelmed by the awesomeness and dire necromancy of all that had befallen him, Sir John was prone to despair, and scant was his hope of returning from that imprisonment amid the dead, or of standing once more under the sun as a living man. It was his to learn the voidness of death, to share the abomination of desolation, and to comprehend the unutterable mysteries of corruption. And to do all this not as one who is a mere insensible cadaver, but with soul and body still inseparate. His flesh crept, and his spirit cringed within him, as he felt the crawling of worms that went avidly to the dwindling corpse or came away in glutted slowness. And it seemed to Sir John at the time, and at all times thereafter, that the condition of his sojourn in the tomb was verily to be accounted a worse thing than death. At last, when many hours or days had gone over him, leaving the tomb's darkness unchanged by the entrance of any beam or the departure of any shadow, Sir John was aware of a sullen clangor, and knew that the brazen door had been opened. And now, for the first time, by the dimness of twilight that had entered the tomb, he saw in all its piteousness and repulsion the thing which he had abode so long. In the sickness that fell upon him at this sight, he was haled forth from the sepulchre by those who had thrust him therein. And fainting once more with the terror of their touch, and shrinking from their gigantic shadowy stature and cerements whose black folds revealed no human visage or form, he was led through Antchar along the road whereby he had to come into that dolorous realm. His guides were silent as before, and the gloom which lay upon the land was even as when he had entered it, and was like the umbrage of some eternal occultation. But at length, in the very place where he had been taken captive, he was left to retrace his own way, and to fare alone through the land of ruinous gardens toward the defile of the crumbling rocks. Weak though he was from his confinement, and all bemazed with the things which had befallen him, he followed the road till the darkness lightened once more, and he came forth from its penumbral shadow beneath a pale sun. And somewhere in the waste he met his charger, wandering through the sunken fields that were covered up by the sand. And he mounted the charger and rode hastily away from Antchar through the pass of the strange boulders, with mocking forms and faces. And after a time he came once more to the northern road by which travelers commonly went to Georgia, and here he was rejoined by the two Armenians who had waited on the confines of Antchar, praying for his secure deliverance. Long afterwards, when he had returned from his wayfaring in the east, and among the peoples of remote isles, he told of the kingdom of Abchaz in the book that related his travels, and also he wrote therein concerning the province of Annise. But he made no mention of Antchar, that kingdom of darkness and decay, ruled by the throned worm. End of Section 1. The Kingdom of the Worm. Section 2 of the collected writings from the Fantasy Fan magazine by Clark Ashton Smith. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Ben Tucker. A Dream of the Abyss. I seemed at the sheer end, albeit mine eyes, in mystery and night, shrouded as with the thick profundity of death, or as if underneath leathern lentors drowned. Saw never lamp nor star, nor dead star's wraith of light, yet seemed I at the world's sheer end, and fearfully and slowly I drew breath from silent gulfs of all uncertainty and dread. Precipitate to nadir from around, nor trusted I on any side to tread one pace, lest I should overstep the brink, and infinitely and forever sink. Past eye shot of the Cyclopean sun, when from the bulwark of the world adown oblivion, he on the morrow should stare after me. Swift, from infinity, the black, unformed enormous fear that lives between the stars, clutched with the cold, great darkness at my heart. Then from the gulf arose a whispering and rustle as of silence on the wing, to stay and stand, anear at my right hand. What powers abysmal, borne o'er the blind black air, what nameless demons of the nether deep, that 'scape the sun and from the moonlight live apart, came and conspired against me there. I heard not ere the whispering ceased, and a heavier darkness seemed to spring upon me, and I felt the silence leap and clasp me closer, and the sweep of all the abyss reach up and drag body and feet from the crumbling uttermost crag to the plumb and infinite emptiness unknown, nor knew I, in tumult of the rapid air, if me did Azrael or Abaddon bear, or if I fell alone. End of Section 2. A Dream of the Abyss. Section 3 of the collected writings from the Fantasy Fan magazine by Clark Ashton Smith. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Ben Tucker. The Ghoul. During the reign of the Caliph Vathek, a young man of good repute and family named Nur-ad-Din Hassan was haled before the Qadi Ahmed bin Bakar at Bussorah. Now Nur-ad-Din was a comely youth, of open and gentle mien, and great was the astonishment of the Qadi and of all others present when they heard the charges that were preferred against him. He was accused of having slain 7 people, one by one, on 7 successive nights, and of having left the corpses in a cemetery near Bussorah, where they were found lying with their bodies and members devoured in a fearsome manner, as if by jackals. Of the people he was said to have slain, 3 were women, 2 were traveling merchants, 1 was a mendicant, and 1 was a gravedigger. Ahmed bin Bakar was filled with the learning and wisdom of honorable years, and withal was possessed of much perspicacity. But he was deeply perplexed by the strangeness and atrocity of these crimes, and by the mild demeanor and well-bred aspect of Nur-ad-Din Hassan, which he could in no wise reconcile with them. He heard in silence the testimony of witnesses who had seen Nur-ad-Din bearing on his shoulders the body of a woman at yester eve in the cemetery, and others who on several occasions had observed him coming from the neighborhood at unseemly hours when only thieves and murderers would be abroad. Then, having considered all these, he questioned the youth closely. "Nur-ad-Din Hassan," he said, "thou hast been charged with crimes of exceeding foulness, which thy bearing and thy lineaments belie. Is there haply an explanation of these things, by which thou canst wholly clear thyself, or in some measure mitigate the heinousness of thy deeds, if so it be that thou art guilty, I adjure thee to tell me the truth in this matter." Now Nur ad-Din Hasan arose before the Cadi, and the heaviness of extreme shame and sorrow was visible on his countenance. "Alas, O Cadi," he replied, "for the charges that have been brought against me are indeed true. It was I and none other who slew these people, nor can I offer any extenuation of my act." The Cadi was sorely grieved and astonished when he heard this answer. "I must perforce believe thee," he said sternly, "but thou hast confessed a thing which will make thy name henceforward an abomination in the ears and mouths of men. I commend thee to tell me why these crimes were committed, and what offense these persons had given thee, or what injury they had done to thee, or if perchance thou slewest them for gain like a common robber." "There was neither offense given nor injury wrought by any of them against me," replied Nur ad-Din, "and I did not kill them for their money or belongings or apparel, since I had no need of such things, and, aside from that, have always been an honest man." "Then," cried Ahmed bin Bakar, greatly puzzled, "what was thy reason if it was none of these?" Now the face of Nur ad-Din Hasan grew heavier still with sorrow, and he bowed his head in a shamefaced manner that bespoke the utterness of profound remorse, and standing thus before the Cadi, he told this story. "The reversals of fortune, O Cadi, are swift and grievous, and beyond the foreknowing of advertence of men. Alas, for less than a fortnight agone, I was the happiest and most guiltless of mortals, with no thought of wrongdoing toward anyone. I was wedded to Amina, the daughter of the jewel merchant Abul Kojia, and I loved her deeply and was much beloved by her in turn. And moreover, we were at this time anticipating the birth of our first child. I had inherited from my father a rich estate and many slaves. The cares of life were light upon my shoulders, and I had, it would seem, every reason to count myself among those whom Allah has blessed with an earthly foretaste of heaven. Judge then the excessive nature of my grief when Amina died in the same hour when she was to have been delivered. From that time, in the dire extremity of my lamentation, I was as one bereft of light and knowledge. I was deaf to all those who sought to condole with me, and blind to their friendly offices. After the burial of Amina, my sorrow became a veritable madness, and I wandered by night to her grave in the cemetery near Bussorah, and flung myself prostrate before the newly lettered tombstone on the earth that had been digged that very day. My senses deserted me, and I knew not how long I remained on the damp clay beneath the cypresses, while the horn of a decrescent moon arose in the heavens. Then in my stupor of abandonment I heard a terrible voice that bade me rise from the ground on which I was lying, and lifting my head a little I saw a hideous demon of gigantic frame and stature, with eyes of scarlet fire beneath brows that were coarse as tangled rootlets, and fangs that overhung a cavernous mouth, and earth-black, longer and sharper than those of the hyena. And the demon said to me, "I am a ghoul, and it is my office to devour the bodies of the dead. I've now come to claim the corpse that was interred today beneath the soil on which thou art lying in a fashion so unmannerly. Begone, for I have fasted since yesternight, and I am much an-hungered." Now at the sight of this demon, and the sound of his dreadful voice, and the still more dreadful meaning of his words, I was like to have swooned with terror on the cold clay. But I recovered myself in a manner, and besought him, saying, "Spare this grave, I implore thee, for she who lies buried therein is dearer to me than any living mortal, and I would not that her fair body should be the provender of an unclean demon such as thou." At this the ghoul was angered, and I thought that he would have done me some bodily violence, but again I besought him, swearing by Allah and Muhammad with many solemn oaths that I would grant him anything procurable, and would do for him any favor that lay in the power of man if he would leave undespoiled the new-made grave of Amina. And the ghoul was somewhat mollified, and he said, "If thou wilt indeed perform for me a certain service, I shall do as thou askest." And I replied, "There is no service, whatsoever its nature, that I will not do for thee in this connection, and I pray thee to name thy desire." Then the ghoul said,
It is this, that thou shalt bring to me each night, for 8 successive nights, the body of one whom thou hast slain with thine own hand. Do this, and I shall neither devour nor dig the body that lies interred hereunder."
Now was I seized by utter horror and despair, since I had bound myself in all honor to grant the ghoul his hideous requirement. And I begged him to change the terms of the stipulation, saying to him, "Is it needful to thee, O eater of corpses, that the bodies should be those of people whom I myself have slain?" And the ghoul said,
"Yea, for all others would be the natural provender of myself or of my kin in any event. I adjure thee by the promise thou hast given to meet me here tomorrow night, when darkness has wholly fallen, or as soon thereafter as thou art able, bring the first of the 8 bodies."
So saying, he strode off among the cypresses and began to dig in another newly made grave at a little distance from that of Amina. I left the graveyard in even direr anguish than when I had come, thinking of that which I must do in fulfillment of my sworn promise, to preserve the body of Amina from the demon. I know not how I survived the ensuing day, torn as I was between sorrow for the dead and my horror of the coming night, with its repugnant duty. When darkness had descended, I went forth by stealth to a lonely road near the cemetery, and waited there amid the low-grown branches of the trees. I slew the first passer with a sword, and carried his body to the spot appointed by the ghoul. And each night thereafter, for 6 more nights, I returned to the same vicinity and repeated this deed, slaying always the very first who came, whether man or woman, or merchant or beggar or gravedigger. And the ghoul awaited me on each occasion, and would begin to devour his provender in my presence, with small thanks and scant ceremony. 7 persons did I slay in all, till only one was wanting to complete the agreed number, and the person whom I slew yesternight was a woman, even as the witnesses have testified. All this I did with utmost repugnance and regret, and sustained only by the remembrance of my plighted word, and the fate which would befall the corpse of Amina, if I should break the bond. This, O Cadi, is all my story. Alas! For those lamentable crimes have availed me not, and I have failed in wholly keeping my bargain with the demon, who will doubtless this night consume the body of Amina, and lean of the one corpse that is still lacking. I resign myself to thy judgment, O Ahmed bin Bakar, and I beseech thee for no other mercy than that of death, wherewith to terminate my double grief and my twofold remorse." When Nur ad-Din Hasan had ended his narrative, the amazement of all who had heard him was verily multiplied, since no man could remember hearing a stranger tale. And the Cadi pondered for a long time, and then gave judgment, saying, "I must needs marvel at thy story, but the crimes thou hast committed are none the less heinous, and Iblis himself would stand aghast before them. However, some allowance must be made for the fact that thou hadst given thy word to the ghoul, and wast bound, as it were, in honor to fulfill his demand, no matter how horrible its nature. And allowance must likewise be made for thy connubial grief, which caused thee to forfend thy wife's body from the demon. Yet I cannot adjudge thee guiltless, though I know not the punishment which is merited in a case so utterly without parallel. Therefore I set thee free, with this injunction, that thou shalt make atonement for thy crimes in the fashion that seemeth best to thee, and shall render justice to thyself and to others in such degree as thou art able." "I thank thee for this mercy," replied Nur ad-Din Hasan, and he then withdrew from the court, amid the wonderment of all who were present. There was much debate when he had gone, and many were prone to question the wisdom of the Cadi's decision. Some there were who maintained that Nur ad-Din should have been sentenced to death without delay for his abominable actions, though others argued for the sanctity of his oath to the ghoul, and would have exculpated him altogether or in part. And tales were told, and instances were cited regarding the habits of ghouls, and the strange plight of men who had surprised such demons in their nocturnal delvings. And again the discussion returned to Nur ad-Din, and the judgment of the Cadi was once more upheld or assailed with divers arguments. But amid all this, Ahmed bin Bakar was silent, saying only, "Wait, for this man will render justice to himself,
and to all other concerned, as far as the rendering thereof is possible."
So indeed it happened. For on the morning of the next day another body was found in the cemetery near Bussorah, lying half devoured on the grave of Nur ad-Din Hassan's wife, Amina. And the body was that of Nur ad-Din, self-slain, who in this manner had not only fulfilled the injunction of the Cadi, but had also kept his bargain with the Ghoul by providing the required number of corpses. End of Section 3, The Ghoul. Section 4 of the collected writings from the Fantasy Fan magazine by Clark Ashton Smith. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. The Weird Works of M.R. James. The 4 books of short stories written by Montague Rhodes James, provost of Eton College, have been collected in a single but not overly bulky volume under the imprint of Longmans, Green and Company. One can heartily recommend the acquisition of this volume to all lovers of the weird and supernatural who are not already familiar with its contents. James is perhaps unsurpassed in originality by any living writer, and he has made a salient contribution to the technique of his genre, as well as to the enriching of its treasury of permanent masterpiece. His work is marked by rare intellectual skill and ingenuity, by power rising at times above the reaches of mere intellection, and by a sheer finesse of writing that will bear almost endless study. It has a peculiar savor, wholly different from the diabolic grimness of Bierce, or the accumulative atmospheric terror and rounded classicism of Machen. Here there is nothing of the feverish but logical hallucinations, the macabre and exotic beauty achieved by Poe, nor is there any kinship to the fine poetic weavings and character nuances of Walter de la Mare, or the far-searching penetrative psychism of Blackwood, or the frightful antiquities and ultra-terrene menaces of Lovecraft. The style of these stories is rather casual and succinct. The rhythms of the prose are brisk and pedestrian, and the phrasing is notable for clearness and incisiveness, rather than for those vague, reverberative overtones which beguile one's inner ear in the prose of fiction writers who are also poets. Usually there is a more or less homely setting, often with a background of folklore and long-past happenings, whose dim archaism provides a depth of shadow from which, as from a recessed cavern, the central horror emerges into the noontide of the present. Things and occurrences, sometimes without obvious offhand relationship, are grouped cunningly, forcing the reader unaware to some frightful deduction, or there is an artful linkage of events, seemingly harmless in themselves, that leave him confronted at a sudden turn with some ghoulish spectre or night demon. The minutiae of modern life, humor, character drawing, scenic, and archaeological description are used as a foil to heighten the abnormal, but are never allowed to usurp a disproportionate interest. Always there is an element of supernatural menace, whose value is never impaired by scientific or spiritualistic explanation. Sometimes it is brought forth at the climax into full light, and sometimes even then it is merely half-revealed, is left undefined but perhaps all the more alarming. In any case, the presence of some unnatural but objective reality is assumed and established. The goblins and phantoms devised by James are truly creative, and are presented through images often so keen and vivid as to evoke an actual physical shock. Sight, smell, hearing, taction are all played upon with well-nigh surgical sureness, by impressions calculated to touch the shuddering quick of horror. Some of the images or similes employed are most extraordinary, and spring surely from the demonic inspiration of the highest genius. For instance, take the unnameable thing in the uncommon prayer book, which resembles a great roll of old shabby white flannel, with a kind of face in the upper end, and which falls forward on a man's shoulder, and hides this face in his neck, like a ferret attacking a rabbit. Then, in Mr. Humphreys and His Inheritance, one of the subtler and more inferential tales, there is the form with a burnt human face and black arms that emerges from an inexplicable hole in the paper plan of a garden maze, with the odious writhings of a wasp creeping out of a rotten apple. In the tractate Midoff, one meets an apparition with thick cobwebs over its eyes, the lich or spectre of a man who, obedient to his own rather eccentric instructions, had been buried sitting at a table in an underground room, and who, upon reading the diary of Mr. Pointer, can fail to share Denton's revulsion when he reaches out, thinking that a dog is beside his chair, and touches a crawling figure covered with long, wavy, Absalom-like tresses. Who, too, can shake off the horror of Denistone in Canon Alberic's scrapbook, when a demon's hand appears from beneath onto the table, suggesting momentarily a pen-wiper, a rat, and a large spider. Reading and rereading these tales, one notes a predilection for certain milieus and motifs. Backgrounds of scholastic or ecclesiastic life are frequent, and some of the best tales are laid in cathedral towns. In many of the supernatural entities, there recurs insistently the character of extreme and repulsive hairiness. Often the apparition is connected with, or evoked by, some material object, such as the bronze whistle from the ruins of a Templar's preceptory, in A Whistle and I'll Come to You, My Lad, the old drawing of King Solomon and the Night Demon in Canon Alberic's scrapbook, the silver Anglo-Saxon crown from an immemorial barrow in A Warning to the Curious, and the strange curtain pattern in the diary of Mr. Pointer, which had a subtlety in its drawing. In several stories there are hints of bygone Satanism and wizardry whose malign wraiths or conjured spirits linger obscurely in modern time, and in at least one tale, Casting the Runes, the warlock is a living figure. In other tales, the forgetful and vanishing phantasms of old crimes cry out their mindless pain, or peer for an instant from familiar pools and shrubberies. The personnel of James's Pandemonium is far from monotonous. One finds a satyr dwelling in a cathedral tomb, a carven, cat-like monster that comes to life when touched by a murderer's hand, a mouldy-smelling sack-like object in an unlit well, which suddenly puts its arms around the neck of a treasure-seeker, a cloaked and hooded shape with a tentacle in lieu of arms, a lean, hideously taloned terror with a jaw shallow as that of a beast, dolls that repeat crime and tragedy, creatures that are dog-like but not dogs, a sawfly, tall as a man, met in a dim room full of rustling insects, and even a weak, ancient thing which, being wholly bodiless and insubstantial, makes for itself a body out of crumpled bed linen. The peculiar genius of M.R. James and his greatest power lies in the convincing evocation of weird, malignant, and preternatural phenomena such as I have instanced. It is safe to say that few writers, dead or living, have equaled him in his formidable necromancy, and perhaps no one has excelled him. End of Section 4, The Weird Works of M.R. James. Section 5 of the collected writings from the Fantasy Fan magazine by Clark Ashton Smith. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. Revenant. I am the spectre who returns unto some desolate world in ruin borne afar, on the black flowing of Lethean skies. Ever I search in cryptic galleries, the void sarcophagi, the broken urns of many a vanished avatar, or haunt the gloom of grumbling pylons vast, and temples that enshrine the shadowy past. Viewless, impalpable and fleet, I roam stupendous avenues and greet familiar sphinxes carved from everlasting stone, or the fair brittle gods of long ago, decayed and fallen low, and there I mark the tall Klepsamiae that time has overthrown, an empty clepsydre, and dials drowned in umbrage never lifting, and there on rusty parapems I read the ephemerides of antique stars and elder planets drifting oblivionward in night, and there with purples of the tomb bedight, and crowned with funeral gems, I hold awhile the throne, whereon mine immemorial selves have sate, canopied by the triple-tinted glory of the three suns forever paled and flown. I am the spectre who returns, and dwells content with his forlorn estate, in mansions lost and hoary, where no lamp burns, who feasts within the sepulchre, and finds the ancient shadows lovelier than gardens all emblazoned with sevenfold noon, or topaz-builded towers that throng below some iris-pouring moon, exiled and homeless in the younger stars. Henceforth I shall inhabit that grey clime, whose days belong to primal calendars, nor would I come again back to the garish terrene hours, for I am free of vaults unfathomable, and treasures lost from time. With bat and vampire there, I flit through somber skies immeasurable, or fly adown the unending subterranes, mummified and ceramented. I sit in councils of the kingly dead, and oftentimes for vestiture I wear the granite of great idols looming darkly in Atlantean fanes, or closely now and starkly I cling as clings the attenuating air about the ruins bare. End of Section 5, Revenant. Section 6 of the collected writings from the Fantasy Fan Magazine by Clark Ashton Smith. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. Prose Pastels 1. Chinoiserie. Ling Yang the poet sits all day in his willow-hidden hut by the riverside and dreams of the Lady Moy. Spring and the swallows have returned from the timeless isles of Amaranth, further than the flight of sails in the unknown south. The silver buds of the willow are breaking into gold, and delicate jade-green reeds have begun to push their way among the brown and yellow rushes of yesteryear. But Ling Yang is heedless of the brightening azure, the light that lengthens, and he has no eye for the northward flight of the waterfowl and the passing of the last clouds that melt and vanish in the flames of an amber sunset. For him there is no season save that moon of waning summer in which he first met the Lady Moy, but a sorrow deeper than the sorrow of autumn abides in his heart. For the heart of Moy is colder to him than high mountain snows above a tropic valley, and all the songs he has made for her, the songs of the flute and the songs of the lute, have found no favor in her hearing. Leagues away in her pavilion of scarlet lacquer and ebony, the Lady Moy reclines on a couch piled with sapphire-colored silks. All day through the gathering gold of the willow foliage, she watches the placid lake, on whose surface the pale green lily pads have begun to widen. Beside her, in a turquoise-studded binding, there lies the verses of the poet Ling Yang, who lived 6 centuries ago, and who sang in all his songs the praise of the Lady Loy, who disdained him. Moy has no need to peruse them any longer, for they live in her memory even as upon the written page. And sighing, she dreams ever of the great poet Ling Yang, and of the melancholy romance that inspired his songs, and wonders enviously at the odd disdain that was shown toward him by the Lady Loy. End of Section 6, Prose Pastels 1. Section 7 of the collected writings from the Fantasy Fan Magazine by Clark Ashton Smith. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. Prose Pastels 2. The Mirror in the Hall of Ebony. From the nethermost profund of slumber, from a gulf beyond the sun and stars that illume the Lethean shoals and the vague lands of somnolent visions, I floated on a black, unrippling tide to the dark threshold of a dream. And in this dream I stood at the end of a long hall that was sealed and floored and walled with sable ebony, and was lit with a light that fell not from the sun or moon, nor from any lamp. The hall was without doors or windows, and at the further extreme an oval mirror was framed in the wall. And standing there I remembered nothing of all that had been, and the other dreams of sleep and the dream of birth and of everything thereafter were alike forgotten. And forgotten too was the name I had found among men, and the other names whereby the daughters of dream had known me, and memory was no older than my coming to that hall. But I wondered not, nor was I troubled thereby, and naught was strange to me, for the tide that had borne me to this threshold was the tide of Lethe. Anon, though I knew not why, my feet were drawn adown the hall, and I approached the oval mirror. And in the mirror I beheld the haggard face that was mine, and the red mark on the cheek where the one I loved had struck me in her anger, and the mark on the throat where her lips had kissed me in amorous devotion. And seeing this, I remembered all that had been, and the other dreams of sleep, and the dream of birth, and of everything thereafter alike returned to me. And thus I recalled the name I had assumed beneath the terrene sun, and the names I had borne beneath the suns of sleep and of reverie. And I marveled much, and was enormously troubled, and all things were most strange to me, and all things were as of yore. End of section 7. Prose Pastels 2. Section 8 of the collected writings from the Fantasy Fan magazine by Clark Ashton Smith. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. Prose Pastels 3. The Muse of Hyperborea. Too far away is her wan and mortal face, and too remote are the snows of her lethal breast, for mine eyes to behold them ever. But at whiles her whisper comes to me, like a chill unearthly wind that is faint from traversing the gulfs between the worlds, and has flown over ultimate horizons of ice-bound deserts. And she speaks to me in a tongue I have never heard, but have always known, and she tells of deathly things, and of things beautiful beyond the ecstatic desires of love. Her speech is not of good or evil, nor of anything that is desired or conceived or believed by the termites of earth, and the air she breathes, and the lands wherein she roams, would blast like the utter cold of sidereal space. And her eyes would blind the vision of men like suns, and her kiss, if one should ever attain it, would wither and slay, like the kiss of lightning. But hearing her far, infrequent whisper, I behold a vision of vast auroras, on continents that are wider than the world, and seas too great for the enterprise of human keels. And at times I stammer forth the strange tidings that she brings, though none will welcome them, and none will believe or listen. And in some dawn of the desperate years I shall go forth, and follow where she calls, to seek the high and beatific doom of her snow-paled distances, to perish amid her indesecrate horizons. End of section 8. Prose Pastels 3. Section 9 of the collected writings from the Fantasy Fan magazine by Clark Ashton Smith. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. Prose Pastels 4. The Lotus and the Moon. I stood with my beloved by the lotus pool, when the moon was round as the great ivory breast of a Titaness, and the flowers were full blown and pale upon the water. And I said to my beloved, I would that thou shouldst love me well tonight, for never again shall there be a night like this, with the meeting of thee and me by this pool with flowers blown, but not overblown. But she demurred, and was perverse, and loved me not as I would that she should love me. And after several nights we stood again by the lotus pool, when the moon was hollow as an aging breast, and the petals of the flowers had fallen apart on the water. And now my beloved was fain to love me well, and all was well between us. But in my heart I mourned for that other night, when the moon was round as the great ivory breast of a Titaness, and the flowers were full blown and pale upon the water. End of section 9. Prose Pastels 4. Section 10 of the collected writings from the Fantasy Fan magazine by Clark Ashton Smith. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. Prose Pastels 5. The Passing of Aphrodite. In all the lands of Valerian, from mountain valleys rimmed with unmelting snow, to the great cliffs of sand whose reflex darkens a sleepy, tepid sea, were lit, as of old, the green and amethyst fires of summer. Spices were on the wind that mountaineers had met in the high glaciers, and the eldest wood of cypress, frowning on a sky-clear bay, was illumined by scarlet orchids. But the heart of the poet Faniol was an urn of black jade overfraught by love with sodden ashes, and because he wished to forget for a time the mockery of myrtles, Faniol walked alone in the waste bordering upon Alarion, in a place that great fires had blackened long ago, and which knew not the pine or the violet, the cypress or the myrtle. There, as the day grew old, he came to an unsailed ocean, whose waters were dark and still under the falling sun, and bore not the memorial voices of other seas, and Faniol paused and lingered upon the ashen shore, and dreamt awhile of that sea whose name is Oblivion. Then from beneath the westering sun, whose bleak light was prone on his forehead, a barge appeared and swiftly drew to the land. Albeit there was no wind, and the oars hung idly on the foamless wave, and Faniol saw that the barge was wrought of ebony, fretted with curious anaglyphs, and carved with luxurious forms of gods and beasts, of satyrs and goddesses and women, and the figurehead was a black Eros, with full unsmiling mouth and implacable sapphire eyes averted, as if intent upon things not lightly to be named or revealed. Upon the deck of the barge were two women, one pale as the northern moon, and the other swart as equatorial midnight. But both were clad imperially, and bore the mien of goddesses, or of those who dwell near to the goddesses. Without word or gesture they regarded Faniol, and marveling he inquired, "What seek ye?" Then with one voice that was like the voice of Hesperian airs among palms at evening twilight in the Fortunate Isles, they answered, saying, "We wait the goddess Aphrodite, who departs in weariness and sorrow from Alarion, and from all the lands of this world of petty loves and pettier mortalities. Thou, because thou art a poet, and hast known the great sovereignty of love, shall behold her departure. But they, the men of the court, the marketplace, and the temple, shall receive no message nor sign of her going forth, and will scarcely dream that she is gone. Now, O Faniol, the time, the goddess, and the going forth are at hand." Even as they ceased, one came across the desert, and her coming was a light on the far hills. And where she trod the lengthening shadows shrunk, and the grey waste put on the purple asphodels and the deep verdure it had worn when those queens were young, that now are a darkening legend and a dust of mumia. Even to the shore she came and stood before Faniol, while the sunset greatened, filling sky and sea with a flush as of new-blown blossoms, or the inmost rose of that coiling shell which was consecrate to her in old time. Without robe or circlet or garland, crowned and clad only with the sunset, fair with the dreams of man, but fairer yet than all dreams. Thus she waited, smiling tranquilly. Who is life or death, despair or rapture, vision or flesh, to gods and poets and galaxies unknowable. But, filled with a wonder that was also love, or much more than love, the poet could find no greeting. "Farewell, O Faniol," she said, and her voice was the sighing of remote waters, the murmur of waters moon withdrawn, forsaking not without sorrow a proud island tall with palms. "Thou hast known me and worshipped all thy days till now, but the hour of my departure is come. I go, and when I am gone thou shalt worship still and shalt not know me. For the destinies are thus, and not forever to any man to any world or to any god is it given to possess me wholly. Autumn and spring will return when I am past, the one with yellow leaves, the other with yellow violets. Birds will haunt the renewing myrtles, and many little loves will be thine. Not again to thee or to any man will return the perfect vision and the perfect flesh of the goddess. Ending thus, she stepped from that ashen strand to the dark prow of the barge. And even as it had come, without wafture or wind or movement of oar, the barge put out on a sea covered with the fallen, fading petals of sunset. Quickly it vanished from view, while the desert lost those ancient asphodels, and the deep verdure it had worn again for a little. Darkness, having conquered Ilarion, came slow and furtive on the path of Aphrodite. Shadows mustered immeasurably to the grey hills, and the heart of the poet Faniol was an urn of black jade, overfraught by love with sodden ashes. End of Section 10, Prose Pastels 5. Section 11 of the collected writings from the Fantasy Fan magazine by Clark Ashton Smith. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. The Epiphany of Death. Dedicated to H.P. Lovecraft. I find it peculiarly difficult to express the exact nature of the sentiment which Tomaron had always evoked in me. However, I am sure that the feeling never partook at any time of what is ordinarily known as friendship. It was a compound of unusual aesthetic and intellectual elements, and was somehow closely allied in my thoughts with the same fascination that has drawn me ever since early childhood toward all things that are remote in space and time, or which have about them the irresolvable twilight of antiquity. Somehow Tomaron seemed never to belong to the present, but one could readily have imagined him as living in some bygone age. About him there was nothing whatever of the lineaments of our own period, and he even went so far as to affect in his costume an approximation to the garments that were worn several centuries ago. His complexion was extremely pale and cadaverous, and he stooped heavily from poring over ancient tomes and no less ancient maps. He moved always with the slow, meditative pace of one who dwells among far-off reveries and memories, and he spoke often of people and events and ideas that have long been forgotten. For the most part, he was apparently unheedful of present things, and I felt that for him the huge city of Ptolemides, in which we both dwelt with all its manifold clamor and tumult, was little more than a labyrinth of painted vapors. Oddly enough, there was a like vagueness in the attitude of others towards Tomaron, and though he had always been accepted without question as a representative of the noble and otherwise extinct family from which he claimed descent, nothing appeared to be known about his actual birth and antecedents. With two servants who were both deaf-mutes, who were very old and who likewise wore the raiment of a former age, he lived in the semi-ruinous mansion of his ancestors, where, it was said, none of the family had dwelt for many generations. There he pursued the occult and recondite studies that were so congenial to his mind, and there at certain intervals I was wont to visit him. I cannot recall the precise date and circumstances of the beginning of my acquaintance with Tomaron. Though I come of a hardy line that is noted for the sanity of its constitution, my faculties have been woefully shaken by the horror of the happening with which that acquaintance ended. My memory is not what it was, and there are certain lacunae for which my readers must contrive to forgive me. The only wonder is that my powers of recollection have survived at all, beneath the hideous burden they have had to bear. For, in a more than metaphoric sense, I have been as one condemned to carry with him at all times and in all places the loathsome incubus of things long dead and corrupt. I can readily recall, however, the studies to which Tomaron had devoted himself. The lost Demonian volumes from Hyperborea and Muse and Atlantis, with which his library shelves were heaped to the ceiling, and the queer charts, not of any land that lies above the surface of the earth, on which he pored by perpetual candlelight. I shall not speak of these studies, for they would seem too fantastic and too macabre for credibility, and that which I have to relate is incredible enough in itself. I shall speak, however, of certain strange ideas with which Tomaron was much preoccupied, and concerning which he so often discoursed to me in that deep, guttural, and monotonous voice of his, that had the reverberation of unsounded caverns in its tones and cadences. He maintained that life and death were not the fixed conditions that people commonly believe them to be, that the two realms were often intermingled in ways not readily discerned, and had penumbral borderlands, that the dead were not always dead, nor the living, as such terms are habitually understood. But the manner in which he spoke of those ideas was extremely vague and general, and I could never induce him to specify his meaning or to proffer some concrete illustration that would render it intelligible to a mentality such as mine, that was unused to dealing in the cobwebs of abstraction. Behind his words there hovered, or seemed to hover, a legion of dark, amorphous images that I could never formulate or depict to myself in any way, till the fatal denouement of our descent into the catacombs of Ptolemides. I have already said that my feeling for Tomaron was never anything that could be classified as friendship, but even from the first I was well aware that Tomaron had a curious fondness for me, a fondness whose nature I could not comprehend, and with which I could hardly even sympathize. Though he fascinated me at all times, there were occasions when my interest was not unalloyed with a sense of actual repulsion. At whiles his pallor was too cadaverous, too suggestive of a fungi that have grown in the dark, or of leprous bones by moonlight, and the stoop of his shoulders conveyed to my brain the idea that they bore a burden of centuries through which no man could conceivably have lived. He aroused always a certain awe in me, and the awe was sometimes mingled with an indeterminate fear. I do not remember how long our acquaintance had continued, but I do remember that he spoke with increasing frequency toward the end of those bizarre ideas at which I have hinted. Also, I felt that he was troubled about something, for he often looked at me with a mournful gleam in his hollow eyes, and sometimes he would speak, with peculiar stress, of the great regard that he had for me. And one night he said,
"Theolus, the time is coming when you must know the truth, must know me as I am, and not as I have been permitted to seem. There is a term to all things, and all things are obedient to inexorable laws. I would that it were otherwise, but neither I nor any man, among the living or among the dead, can lengthen at will the term of any state or condition of being, or alter the laws that decree such conditions."
Perhaps it was well that I did not understand him, and that I was unable to attach much importance to his words or to the singular intentness of his bearing as he uttered them. For a few more days I was spared the knowledge which I now carry. Then one evening Tomaron spoke thus:
"I am now compelled to ask an odd favor of you, which I hope you will grant me, in consideration of our long friendship. The favor is that you accompany me this very night to those vaults of my family which lie in the catacombs of Ptolemides."
Though much surprised by the request, and not altogether pleased, I was nevertheless unable to deny him. I could not imagine the purpose of such a visit as the one proposed, but as was my wont, I forbore to interrogate Tomaron, and merely told him that I would accompany him to the vaults, if such were his desire.
"I thank you, Theolus, for this proof of friendship," he replied earnestly. "Believe me, I am loath to ask it, but there has been a certain deception, an odd misunderstanding which cannot go on any longer. Tonight you will know the truth."
Carrying torches, we left the mansion of Tomaron and sought the ancient catacombs of Ptolemides, which lie beyond the walls and have long been disused, for there is now a fine necropolis in the very heart of the city. The moon had gone down beyond the desert that encroaches toward the catacombs, and we were forced to light our torches long before we came to the subterranean adits, for the rays of Mars and Jupiter in a sodden and funereal sky were not enough to illumine the perilous path we followed among mounds and fallen obelisks and broken graves. At length we discovered the dark and weed-choked entrance of the charnels, and here Tomeron led the way with a swiftness and surety of footing that bespoke long familiarity with the place. Entering, we found ourselves in a crumbling passage where the bones of dilapidated skeletons were scattered amid the rubble that had fallen from the sides and roof. A choking stench of stagnant air and of age-old corruption made me pause for a moment, but Tomeron scarcely appeared to perceive it, for he strode onward, lifting his torch and beckoning me to follow. We traversed many vaults in which moldy bones and verdigris-eaten sarcophagi were piled about the walls, or strewn where desecrating thieves had left them in bygone years. The air was increasingly dank, chill and miasmal, and mephitic shadows crouched or swayed before our torches in every niche and corner. Also, as we went onward, the walls became more ruinous, and the bones we saw in every hand were greener with the mold of time. At last we rounded a sudden angle of the low cavern we were following. Here we came to vaults that evidently belonged to some noble family, for they were quite spacious, and there was but one sarcophagus in each vault.
"My ancestors and family lie here,"
said Tomeron. We reached the end of the cavern and were confronted by a blank wall. At one side was the final vault, in which an empty sarcophagus stood open. The sarcophagus was wrought of the finest bronze, and was richly carven. Tomeron paused before the vault and turned to me. By the flickering, uncertain light, I thought that I saw a look of strange and unaccountable distress on his features.
"I must beg you to withdraw for a moment," he said,
in a low and sorrowful voice.
"Afterwards you can return."
Surprised and puzzled, I obeyed his request and went slowly back along the cavern for some distance. Then I returned to the place where I had left him. My surprise was heightened when I found that he had extinguished his torch and had dropped it on the threshold of the final vault. Also, Tomeron himself was not visible anywhere. Entering the vault, since there was no other place where he could have hidden himself, I looked about for him, but the room was empty. At least I deemed it empty till I looked again at the richly carven sarcophagus, and saw that it was now tenanted, for a cadaver lay within, shrouded in a winding sheet of a sort that had not been used for centuries in Ptolemaids. I drew nigh to the sarcophagus, and peering into the face of the cadaver, I saw that it bore a fearful and strange resemblance to the face of Tomeron, though it was bloated and puffed with the adipocere of death, and was purple with the shadows of decay, as after long ages in a charnel air. And looking again, I saw that it was, indeed, Tomeron. I would have screamed aloud with the horror that came upon me, but my lips were benumbed and frozen, and I could only whisper Tomeron's name. But as I whispered it, the lips of the cadaver seemed to part, and the tip of its tongue protruded between them, and I thought that the tip trembled, as if Tomeron were about to speak and answer me. But gazing more closely, I saw that the trembling was merely the movement of worms as they twisted up and down, and to and fro, and sought to crowd each other from Tomeron's tongue. End of section 11, The Epiphany of Death. Section 12 of the collected writings from the Fantasy Fan magazine by Clark Ashton Smith. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. Necromancy. My heart is made a necromancer's glass, where homeless forms and exile phantoms teem, where faces of forgotten sorrows gleam, and dead despairs archaic peer and pass. Grey longings of some weary heart that was possess me, and the multiple supreme, unwildered hope and star-emblazoned dream of questing armies ancient queen and lass. Risen vampire-like from out the wormy mold, deep in the magic mirror of my heart, behold their perished beauty and depart, and now from black Aphelions far and cold, swimming in deathly light on charnel skies, the enormous ghosts of bygone worlds arise. End of section 12. Necromancy. Section 13 of the collected writings from the Fantasy Fan magazine by Clark Ashton Smith. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. Clark Aston Smith, an Autobiographette. I am inclined to think that my life is a pretty good exemplification of the theories propounded by Lester Anderson in his interesting and provocative article on superstition. Anyhow, I was born on Friday the 13th, under Capricornus and Saturn, and have been flirting with most of the other orthodox jinxes ever since. I do not whistle in the dark. I have never gone in for dream books or psychoanalysis, and I make a habit of walking under ladders when it is more convenient to do this than circumambulate the obstruction. As to black cats, well, I have owned one for many years, a most sinister-looking creature with all the aspects of an old-time wizard's familiar. Perhaps all this may help to explain the kumis and the coconut, and may account for my ability to peruse the most horrendous stuff without batting an eyelash. Also, since there are modern superstitions as well as ancient ones, it may throw a light on my complete lack of faith in the 5-year plan, epic, and all other cockeyed utopian schemes. Moreover, it may help to explain my open mind in regard to all outre and inexplicable phenomena, and the fact that I can take the theories of Einstein, as well as of modern science in general, with a salutary pinch of saline seasoning. End of section 13. Clark Ashton Smith, an Autobiographette. Section 14 of the collected writings from the Fantasy Fan magazine by Clark Ashton Smith. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. On Fantasy. We have been told that literature dealing with the imaginative and fantastic is out of favor among the intellectuals, whoever they are. Only the real, whatever that is or may be, is admissible for treatment, and writers must confine themselves to themes well within the range of statisticians, lightning calculators, Freud and Krafft-Ebing, the Hearst and McFadden publications, NRA, and mail-order catalogs. Chimeras are no longer the mode. The infinite has been abolished. Mystery is obsolete, and Sphinx and Medusa are toys for children. The weird and the unearthly are outlawed, and all mundane impossibilities, which it may be are the commonplaces of the Pleiades, have been banished to some limbo of literalistic derision. One may write of horses and hippopotami, but not of hippogriffs, of biographers, but not of ghouls, of slum harlots or the hetairae of Nob Hill, but not of succubi. In short, all pipe dreams, all fantasies not authorized by Freudianism, by sociology, and the 5 senses, are due for the critical horse laugh, when through ignorance, effrontery, or preference, they find a place in the subject matter of some author unlucky enough to have been born into the age of Jeffers, Hemingway, and Joyce. Let us examine these amazing dicta, fathered as they must be by people whose literal mindedness can be surpassed only by that of their 4-footed betters. Surely it is axiomatic that in thought or art we deal not with things themselves, but with concepts of things. One may write, like Villon, of Muckle Meg and the Fair Helm Maker, or like Sterling, evoke Lilith and the blue-eyed vampire. In either case, only figments of the poet's mind are presented. It is for the creator, not the critic, to choose that image or symbol which suits him best. People who cannot endure anything with a tinge of trope or fantasy should confine their reading to the census returns. There, if anywhere, they will find themselves on safe ground. To touch on other considerations, why this thirst for literalism, for nothing but direct anthropological data, which would prescribe the infinitudes of imagination, would bar all that can lift us, even in thought, above the interests of the individual or the species? Does it not imply a sort of cosmic provincialism, an overweening racial egomania? Indeed, if all things fantastic or impossible are to be barred as literary subjective matter, where is one to draw the line? Many thinkers who lived before Freud, and some who live contemporaneously with him, have maintained that the world itself is a fantasy, or, in de Cassere's phrase, a superstition of the senses. Gautier has pointed out that we live only by illusion, by a process of seeing ourselves and all things as they are not. The animals alone, being without imagination, have no escape from reality. From paretic to psychoanalyst, from poet to rag-picker, we are all in flight from the real. Truth is what we desire it to be, and the facts of life are a masquerade in which we imagine that we have identified the maskers. The highest intellectuals have always delighted in poetic fantasy and philosophic paradox, knowing well that the universe itself is multiform fantasy and paradox, and that everything perceived or conceived as actuality is merely one phase of that which has or may have innumerable aspects. In this phantom whirl of the infinite, among these veils of Maya that are sevenfold behind sevenfold, nothing is too absurd, too lovely, or dreadful to be impossible. End of section 14. On fantasy. Section 15 of the collected writings from the Fantasy Fan magazine by Clark Ashton Smith. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. The favorite weird stories of Clark Ashton Smith, courtesy of H. Koenig. The Yellow Sign by Chambers. The House of Sounds by Scheel. The Willows by Blackwood. A View from a Hill by James. The Death of Halpin Fraser by Bierce. The House of Usher by Poe. The Mask of Red Death by Poe. The White Powder by Machen. The Call of Cthulhu by Lovecraft. The Color Out of Space. End of section 15. The favorite weird stories of Clark Ashton Smith. Section 16 of the collected writings from the Fantasy Fan magazine by Clark Ashton Smith. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. The Demonian Face. About 1918 I was in ill health, and during a short visit to San Francisco was sitting one day in the Bohemian Club, to which I had been given a guest's card of admission. Happening to look up, I saw a frightful demonian face with twisted, root-like eyebrows and oblique, fiery, slitted eyes, which seemed to emerge momentarily from air about 9 feet above me and lean toward my seat. The thing disappeared as it approached me, but left an ineffaceable impression of malignity, horror, and loathsomeness. If an hallucination, it was certainly seen amid appropriate surroundings. If an actual entity, it was no doubt the kind that would be likely to haunt a club in one of our modern Gomorrahs. End of section 16. The Demonian Face. Section 17 of the collected writings from the Fantasy Fan magazine by Clark Ashton Smith. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. Medusa. Written at the age of 18. As drear and barren as the glooms of death, It lies a windless land of livid dawns, nude to a desolate firmament with hills that seem the fleshless earth's out-jutting ribs, and plains whose face is crossed and riveled deep, with gullies twisting like a serpent's track. The leprous touch of death is on its stones, wherefore his token visible, the head, is throned upon a heap of monstrous rocks, rough-mounded like some shattered pyramid in a thwartly cloven hill ravine that seems the unhealing scar of Tellurian wars. Her lethal beauty crowned with twining snakes that animate her hair, the Gorgon reigns. Her eyes are clouds wherein death's lightnings lurk, yet even as men that seek the glance of life, the gazers come where, coiled and serpent-swift, those levins wait. As round an altar base, her victims lie distorted blackened forms, of posture, horror, smitten into stone, time caught in meshes of eternity, drawn back from dust and ruin of the years, and given to all the future of the world. The land is claimed of death. The daylight comes, half strangled in the changing webs of cloud, that unseen spiders of bewildered winds weave and unweave across the lurid sun in upper air. Below no zephyr comes to break with life the circling spell of doom. Long vapor serpents twist about the moon, and in the windy murkness of the sky the guttering stars are wild as candle flames that near the socket. Thus the land shall be, and death shall wait, throned in Medusa's eyes, till in the irremeable webs of night the sun is snared, and the corroded moon a dust upon the gulfs, and all the stars, rotted and fallen like rivets from the sky, letting the darkness down upon all things. End of section 17. Medusa. Section 18 of the collected writings from the Fantasy Fan magazine by Clark Ashton Smith. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. The Primal City. In these after days, when all things are touched with insoluble doubt and dereliction, I am not sure of the purpose that had taken us into that little visited land. I recall, however, that we had found explicit mention in a volume of which we possessed the one existing copy of certain vast pre-human ruins lying amid the bare plateaus and stark pinnacles of the region. How we had acquired the volume, I do not know, but Sebastian Polder and I had given our youth and much of our manhood to the quest of hidden knowledge, and this book was a compendium of all things that men have forgotten or ignored in their desire to repudiate the inexplicable. We, being enamored of mystery and seeking ever for the clues that material science has disregarded, pondered much upon those pages written in an antique alphabet. The location of the ruins was clearly stated, though in terms of an obsolete geography, and I remember our excitement when we had marked the position on a terrestrial globe. From the very first we were eager to behold the alien city, and certain of our ability to find it. Perhaps we wished to verify a strange and fearful theory which we had formed regarding the nature of the Earth's primal inhabitants. Perhaps we sought to recover the buried records of a lost science, or perhaps there was some other and darker objective. I recall nothing of the first stages of our journey, which must have been long and arduous, but I recall distinctly that we traveled for many days amid the bleak, treeless uplands that rose rapidly like a tiered embankment toward the range of high pyramidal summits guarding our destination. Our guide was a native of the country, sodden and taciturn, with intelligence little above that of the llamas which carried our supplies. He had never visited the ruins, but we had been assured that he knew the way, which was a secret remembered by few of his fellow countrymen. Rare and scant was the local legendary concerning the place and its builders. and after many queries we could add nothing to the knowledge gained from the immemorial volume. The city, it seemed, was nameless, and the region about it was untrodden by man. Desire and curiosity raged within us like a calenture, and we gave no heed to the hazards and travails of exploration. Over us stood the eternal azure of vacant heavens, matching in their desolation the empty landscape. The route steepened, and above us now was a wilderness of cragged and chasmed rock, where nothing dwelt but the sinister wide-winged condors. Often we lost sight of certain eminent peaks that had served us for landmarks, but it seemed that our guide knew the way, as if led by an instinct more subtle than memory or intelligence, and at no time did he hesitate. At intervals we came to the broken fragments of a paved road that had formerly traversed the whole of this difficult region, broad, cyclopean flags of Nice, channeled as if by the storms of cycles older than human history, and in some of the deeper chasms we saw the eroded piers of great bridges that had spanned them in other time. These ruins reassured us, for in the primordial volume there was mention of a highway and of mighty bridges leading to the fabulous city. Polder and I were exultant, and yet I think we both shivered with a curious terror when we tried to read certain inscriptions that were still deeply engraved on the worn stones. No living man, though erudite in all the tongues of earth, could have deciphered those characters, and perhaps it was their very alienage that frightened us. We had sought diligently during laborious years for all that transcends the dead level of mortality through age or remoteness or strangeness. We had longed ardently for the esoteric and bizarre, but such longing was not incompatible with fear and repulsion. Better than those who had walked always in the common paths, we knew the perils that might attend our exorbitant and solitary researches. Often we had debated, with variously fantastic conjectures, the enigma of the mountain-builded city. But toward our journey's end, when the vestiges of that pristine people multiplied around us, we fell into long periods of silence, sharing the taciturnity of our stolid guide. Thoughts came to us that were overly strange for utterance. The chill of elder eons entered our hearts from the ruins, and did not depart. We toiled on between the desolate rocks and the sterile heavens, breathing an air that became thin and painful to the lungs, as if with some admixture of cosmic ether. At high noon we reached an open pass, and saw before and above us, at the end of a long and quickly opened perspective, the city that had been described as an unnamed ruin in a volume antedating all other known books. The place was built on an inner peak of the range, surrounded by snowless summits, little sterner and loftier than itself. On one side the peak fell in 1,000-foot precipice from the overhanging ramparts. On another it was terraced with wild cliffs. But the third side, facing toward us, was a steep acclivity with broken-down scarps and chimneys that would offer small difficulty to expert mountaineers. The rock of the whole mountain was strangely ruinous and black, but the city walls, though gapped and worn to a like dilapidation, were conspicuous at a distance of leagues. Polder and I beheld the bourne of our world-wide search with thoughts and emotions which we did not voice. The Indian made no comment, pointing impassively toward the far summit, with its crown of ruins. We hurried on, wishing to complete our journey by daylight, and plunging into an abysmal valley. We began at mid-afternoon the ascent of the slope toward the city. We were impressed anew by the abnormal and manifold cleavages of the granite. It was like climbing amid the overthrown and fire-blasted blocks of a Titan citadel. Everywhere the slope was rent into huge, obliquely angled masses, often partly vitrified, which made the ascent a more arduous problem than we had expected. Plainly, at some former time, the stone had been subjected to the action of heat, and yet there was no volcanic craters amid the nearby mountains. Puzzling greatly, I recalled a passage in the old volume, hinting ambiguously at the dark fate that had long ago destroyed the city's inhabitants. But from this passage I could still draw no definite conclusion, for the ideation was too fantastic to be understood as anything more than a dubious figure of speech. We had left our 3 llamas at the slope's bottom, merely taking with us provisions for a night. Thus, unhampered, we made fair progress in spite of the ever-varying obstacles offered by the shattered scarps. After a while we came to the hewn steps of a stairway mounting to the summit, but the steps had been wrought for the feet of colossi, and in many places they were part of the heaved and tilted ruin, so they did not greatly facilitate our climbing. The sun was still high above the western pass behind us, and for this reason, as we went on, I was much surprised by a sudden deepening of the char-like blackness on the rocks. Turning, I saw that several grayish, vapory masses, which might have been either cloud or smoke, were drifting idly about the summits that overlooked the pass. And one of these masses, rearing like a limbless figure, upright and colossal, had interposed itself between us and the sun. Sebastian and the guide had also noted this phenomenon. Clouds were almost unheard of amid those mountains in summer, and the presence of smoke would have been equally hard to explain. Moreover, the gray masses were wholly detached from each other and showed a peculiar opacity and sharpness of outline. At second glance, they did not really resemble any cloud forms we had ever seen, for about them there was a baffling suggestion of weight and solidity. Moving sluggishly into the heavens above the pass, they preserved their original contours and their separateness. They seemed to swell and tower, coming toward us on the blue air from which as yet no lightest stirring of wind had reached us. Floating thus, they maintained the rectitude of massive columns or of giants marching on a broad plain. I think we all felt an alarm that was none the less urgent for its vagueness. Somehow from that instant it seemed that we were pinned up by unknown powers and were cut off from all possibility of retreat. We had ventured into a place of hidden peril, and the peril was upon us. In the movement of the strange clouds there was something alert, deliberate, and implacable. Polder spoke with a sort of horror in his voice, uttering the thought which had already occurred to me. "They are the sentinels who guard this region, and they have espied us." We heard a harsh cry from the Indian. Following his gaze, we saw that several of the unnatural cloud shapes had appeared on the summit toward which we were climbing, above the megalithic ruins. Some arose half hidden by the walls as if from behind a breastwork. Others stood, as it were, on the topmost towers and battlements, bulking in portentous menace, like the cumuli of a thunderstorm. Then, with terrible swiftness, many more of the cloud presences towered simultaneously from the 4 quarters, emerging from behind the gaunt peaks or assuming sudden visibility in mid-air. With equal and effortless speed, as if convoked by an unheard command, they gathered in converging lines upon the air-like ruins. We, the climbers, and the whole slope about us, and the valley below, were plunged in a twilight weird and awesome as that of central eclipse. The air was still windless, but it weighed upon us as if burdened with the wings of 1,000 cacodemons. I remember that I was overwhelmingly conscious of our exposed position, for we had paused on a wide landing of the mountain-hewn steps. We could easily have concealed ourselves amid the huge fragments on the surrounding slope. Before the nonce, we were incapable of the simplest movement. In a close-ranged army, the clouds mustered above and around us. They rose into the very zenith, swelling to insuperable vastness, and darkening like Tartarian gods. The sun had disappeared, leaving no faintest beam to prove that it still hung unfallen and undestroyed in the heavens. I felt that I was crushed into the very stone by the eyeless regard of that awful assemblage, judging and condemning. We had trespassed upon a region conquered long ago by strange elemental entities. We had approached their very citadel, and now we must meet the doom our rashness had invited. Such thoughts, like a black lightning, flared in my brain. Now for the first time I became aware of sound, if the word can be applied to a sensation so anomalous. It was as if the oppression that weighed upon me had grown audible, as if palpable thunders poured over and past me. I felt I heard them in every nerve, and they roared through my brain like torrents from the opened floodgates of some tremendous weir in a world of genii. Downward upon us, with limbless Atlantean stridings, there swept the cloudy cohorts. Their swiftness was that of supernatural things. The air was riven as if by the tumult of 1,000 tempests, was rife with an unmeasured elemental malignity. I recall but partially the events that ensued, but the impression of insufferable darkness, of demonic clamor and trampling, and the pressure of thunderous, burdenous onset remains forever indelible. Also, there were voices that called out with the stridor of clarions in a war of gods, uttering ominous syllables that the ear of man could never seize. Before those vengeful shapes, we could not stand for a moment. We hurled ourselves with a mad precipitation down the shadowed steps of the giant stairs. Polder and the guide were a little ahead of me, to the left hand, and I saw them in that baleful twilight on the verge of a deep chasm, which in our ascent had compelled us to much circumambulation. I saw them leap together, and yet I swear that they did not fall into the chasm, for one of the shapes was upon them, whirling and stooping even as they sprang. There was a blasphemous, unthinkable fusion as of forms beheld in delirium. For an instant the two men were like vapors that swelled and swirled, towering high as the thing that had caught them, and the thing itself was a misty Janus, with two heads and bodies melting, no longer human, into its unearthly column. After that I remember nothing more except the sense of vertiginous falling. By some miracle I must have reached the edge of the chasm and flung myself into its depths without being overtaken as the others had been. How I escaped the pursuit of those cloudy guardians is forevermore an enigma. Perhaps for some inscrutable reason of their own they permitted me to go. When I returned to awareness, stars were peering down upon me like chill, incurious eyes between black and jagged lips of rock. The air had turned sharp with the coldness of nightfall in a mountain land. My body ached with 100 bruises, and my right forearm was limp and useless when I tried to raise myself. A dark mist of horror stifled my thoughts. Struggling to my feet with pain-racked effort, I called aloud, though I knew that none would answer me. Then, striking match after match, I searched the chasm and found myself, as I had expected, alone. Nowhere was there any trace of my companions. They had vanished utterly, as clouds vanish. Somehow by night, with a broken arm, I must have climbed from the steep fissure. I must have made my way down the frightful mountainside, and out of that namelessly haunted and guarded land. I remember that the sky was clear, that the stars were undimmed by any semblance of cloud, and that somewhere in the valley I found one of our llamas, still laden with its stock of provisions. Plainly, I was not pursued by the guardians. Perhaps they were concerned only with the warding of that mysterious Primal City from human intrusion. Never shall I learn the secret of those ruinous walls and crumbling keeps, nor the fate of my companions. But still, through my nightly dreams and diurnal visions, the dark shapes move with the tumult and thunder of 1,000 storms, and my soul is crushed into the earth with the burden of their imminence. And they pass over me with the speed and vastness of vengeful gods, and I hear their voices calling like clarions in the sky with ominous, world-shaking syllables that the ear can never seize. End of Section 18, The Primal City. End of the collected writings from the Fantasy Fan Magazine by Clark Ashton Smith.